There are moments in Genoa City when the truth does not arrive as liberation. It arrives as punishment. It arrives when people are already too wounded to absorb it cleanly, when guilt has had years to deepen its roots, when a family secret does not simply ask to be acknowledged but demands blood, sacrifice, and the collapse of every false protection built around it. That is the storm now closing in around Lily, Malcolm, Holden, Claire, and Stephanie. A storm fed not only by illness but by timing, regret, humiliation, and the unbearable cruelty of needing the very person who has every reason to turn away. What should have been a private reckoning of the heart has become something far more volatile, because when a man's life depends on a truth kept buried for decades, every relationship around that truth begins to burn. Nothing remains gentle for long. Not grief, not love, not family, not even hope. For Lily, the devastation begins in the most intimate way possible, with the body itself becoming a betrayal. She had clung to the belief that if Malcolm needed saving, she would be the one to do it. That certainty was not born from vanity or from some desire to be praised as a hero. It came from a wound so old and so private that she had barely found the language to live around it. The loss of Neil had never stopped being an ache inside her. It had merely changed shape over time, hardening into a permanent layer of regret she carried beneath every act of strength. She had never forgiven the helplessness of that grief. She had never made peace with how abruptly life had taken away the chance to do more, say more, protect more. So when Malcolm's illness forced the family into crisis, Lily did not just see danger. She saw a terrible chance at redemption. She saw a way to do now what she could not do then. She saw a path toward quieting the shame of surviving one father's death without being able to stop it. That is why the news that she cannot be Malcolm's donor lands with such brutality. It is not merely disappointing, it is annihilating. Her past treatment, the history her body carries from another battle, has now locked her out of the one role that felt emotionally necessary. Her love is real. Her determination is real. But her marrow is useless for the man she is desperate to save. That realization opens something dark inside her. Lily is not the kind of woman who collapses easily in public, but private pain has a way of sharpening the mind into dangerous places. The more she sits with the truth that she cannot help Malcolm directly, the more her thoughts begin turning outward, searching for someone else who can do what she no longer can. That is where Holden becomes less a person than a possibility. And that is where Lily's grief starts evolving into a form of pressure she may not fully recognize in herself at first. She knows Holden is confused. She knows he has just learned Malcolm is his biological father. She knows he has every reason to feel cheated, furious, and emotionally ambushed by the timing of it all. Yet compassion becomes harder to sustain when Malcolm's condition grows more urgent. Lily begins to resent every second Holden spends processing. Every moment he hesitates, every flicker of uncertainty that delays what she sees as obvious moral duty. She tells herself that she understands his pain, but the truth is harsher. Part of her does not care how much pain Holden is in, not when Malcolm's survival may depend on him. That thought horrifies her, yet it keeps returning, because desperation strips away the comfortable lies decent people tell themselves about patience and respect. Lily is losing her ability to separate Holden's emotional rights from Malcolm's medical need, and that internal collapse becomes one of the most dangerous currents in the entire story. Her decision to turn to Tracy reveals how close to the edge she truly is. Tracy has always represented something grounding, something compassionate, something steady enough to absorb other people's chaos without turning away. Lily does not go to her because she needs polite reassurance. She goes because she is afraid of what she is becoming beneath the strain. She needs someone who will listen without exploiting her vulnerability, someone who can understand the difference between grief and obsession before the line disappears entirely. Yet even in that moment of seeking comfort, Lily is not entirely innocent. The pain she brings to Tracy is genuine, but so is her need to gather strength for the fight ahead. She wants wisdom, yes, but she also wants validation for the strategy already forming in her heart. That Holden must be reached, persuaded, cornered if necessary. Until he agrees, Tracy may offer gentle words, but Lily hears them through a mind already preparing for battle. Every expression of support becomes fuel. Every reminder that family matters becomes another justification. Every small kindness she receives only makes her feel more morally entitled to demand sacrifice from the brother she has barely had time to know. Meanwhile, Holden is being crushed under a revelation that has rearranged the meaning of his life in an instant. Learning that Malcolm is his biological father is not the kind of truth that can be absorbed with sentimental tears and immediate forgiveness. It is an explosion disguised as information. It forces him to revisit his past not as memory, but as evidence. Every absence now means something different. Every unanswered question becomes accusation. Every decision Stephanie made on his behalf now looks like theft. Holden has not merely been denied a relationship with Malcolm. He has been denied ownership of his own story, and that violation changes the emotional chemistry of everything around him. He is not being asked to process a family secret on neutral ground. He is being asked to process it while the newly revealed father at the center of it may die without his help. That timing is almost obscene. It makes grief and duty indistinguishable. It turns curiosity into obligation. It makes blood feel like a trap. What terrifies Holden most is not that everyone suddenly needs something from him. It is that they need something only now, only because time is running out, only because Malcolm's body has made the truth urgent in a way love apparently never did. That realization is poisonous. It leads him into a fury so deep that even his better instincts struggle to survive inside it. He cannot ignore the suspicion that if Malcolm were healthy, he might never have known any of this at all. He cannot stop imagining how long Stephanie would have kept the secret if illness had not forced her hand. He cannot escape the ugly possibility that his value in this story exists only because his biology is suddenly useful. That thought dehumanizes him. It makes every appeal to compassion feel manipulative, every expression of hope feel transactional, every mention of family feel like emotional extortion dressed up as destiny. Holden wants to do the right thing, but he no longer trusts anyone else's definition of what right means. He does not want to be bullied by blood into a relationship he did not choose. He does not want to be spiritually conscripted into a family crisis created by someone else's cowardice. Yet neither can he shut off the strange growing awareness that Malcolm's fate may genuinely sit in his hands. That awareness invades his anger with something even harder to endure: conscience. Claire steps into this emotional minefield at precisely the moment Holden is most unstable, and that makes her role far more dangerous than it first appears. On the surface, she is simply the one person he feels able to confide in, the calm presence willing to hear the confusion without trying to immediately convert it into duty. But Claire's connection to Holden is not neutral. She has already seen enough of him to believe that beneath his reserve, his evasions, and the secrets he has carried, there is still a decent heart fighting not to harden completely. That belief becomes both her strength and her vulnerability. She approaches him with sympathy, but sympathy can quickly become intimacy when two people meet in the middle of pain. The more Holden allows himself to be seen by Claire, the more he risks needing her opinion in ways that expose his emotional dependence. The more Claire sees his wounded side, the more invested she becomes in the outcome. Their growing closeness is not built on romance alone. It is built on crisis, and crisis has a way of accelerating trust while also distorting it. Claire senses almost immediately that Holden is standing at a moral crossroads capable of defining the rest of his life. She does not push him crudely, because she understands that any direct pressure might drive him further into resistance. But she cannot be indifferent either. Holden is too close to a decision with too much human cost attached to it, so Claire becomes a mirror, reflecting back the parts of him he is trying hardest to suppress, the conscience he resents, the compassion he fears will make him weak, the buried decency that will not let him simply walk away in peace. She knows that if he refuses to test, he may spend years telling himself he was protecting his dignity while quietly rotting from the knowledge that he allowed bitterness to become irreversible. At the same time, she knows the cruelty of pretending the decision is easy. Holden is not choosing whether to help a beloved father. He is choosing whether to save a stranger whose existence was hidden from him until his body began to fail. Claire understands enough about trauma to know that such a decision can never come clean. And yet the more she comforts Holden, the more she becomes entangled in the outcome herself. If he tests, she will have been part of that shift. If he refuses, she will carry the knowledge that even her faith in his better nature could not move him. Their bond deepens precisely because both possibilities are so emotionally costly. Lily, however, may not view Claire's involvement with the same generosity. As the pressure intensifies, Lily begins to see every relationship around Holden in strategic terms. She notices the ease with which he opens up to Claire, the patience he grants her, the vulnerability he hides from others but shows to this woman who has somehow become his emotional refuge. Under ordinary circumstances, Lily might appreciate that someone is helping Holden sort through the wreckage, but these are not ordinary circumstances. Malcolm is sick, time is shrinking, and Lily's desperation is turning every human connection into a calculation. She may begin to resent the influence Claire has, particularly if Claire seems to be the one person whose guidance Holden truly values. That resentment would not necessarily emerge as outright hostility at first. It would show up in smaller, sharper ways, in the tightening of Lily's tone, in the suspicion that Claire's compassion is too gentle, too slow, too respectful of Holden's autonomy for a crisis that requires immediate action. Lily may even fear that Claire, by honoring Holden's right to choose, is accidentally enabling delay. Once that fear takes hold, the seeds of conflict are planted, because desperation rarely tolerates moderation in others. At the center of all this stands Malcolm, whose illness has stripped his life down to its most humiliating truths. He is not merely sick, he is dependent. He is forced to sit with the unbearable reality that the son he never openly raised, the son whose existence was protected by secrecy and distance, may now be the one person able to keep him alive. That irony cuts into him more deeply than the disease. He cannot think about Holden without also thinking about everything lost to time, to silence, to missed responsibility, to the selfish or frightened decisions other people made, and perhaps the ones he failed to challenge hard enough himself. Even if Malcolm had been denied full access to the truth, even if he had not been the sole architect of the lie, the outcome still leaves him morally exposed. A father does not need malicious intent to cause damage. Absence is damage. Silence is damage. Delay is damage. Now that damage sits across from him in human form, confused and angry, and perhaps carrying the key to his survival. Malcolm is caught between hope and shame. He wants Holden to test, but he knows that wanting it makes him appear hungry for a son only when death is near enough to matter. He hates that. He hates the optics of it, the emotional debt of it, the helplessness of needing grace from someone who inherited none of the history that should have made such grace easier. His conversation with Stephanie becomes one of the rawest emotional detonations in the story, because there are some betrayals that remain abstract until illness forces them into the open. Stephanie has lived too long inside her justifications. Whatever fear, pride, caution, or emotional self-protection once fueled her silence, those motives have now curdled under the pressure of consequence. She can say she regrets the delay, and perhaps she truly does. She can promise to do the right thing now, and perhaps that promise is sincere. But sincerity arriving late has a different texture. It no longer feels clean. Malcolm sees that. He is too wounded, too frightened, and too exhausted to be comforted by remorse alone. What Stephanie hid did not merely postpone a difficult truth. It created an emotional disaster zone in which a son already in shock must now decide whether to save the father he was denied. Her secret did not protect anyone. It produced a future in which illness and identity collide at the worst possible moment. Malcolm knows this, and whatever tenderness remains between them must now compete with rage. He cannot even fully indulge that rage because he needs the outcome too much. That is the cruelty of his position. He is furious with Stephanie, but he also needs her not to collapse, because chaos will only drive Holden further away. Stephanie, for her part, is living through the destruction of her own authority. She has crossed the point where explanations can save her image. The more she tries to frame the delay as complicated, the more she hears her own words harden into cowardice. She is not simply ashamed, she is terrified. Terrified that Holden will never forgive her. Terrified that Malcolm will die still burdened by the consequences of her secret. Terrified that every future version of herself will be defined not by the reason she had, but by the pain she caused. That terror makes her erratic. One moment she wants to throw herself into full confession, exposing every corner of the past in the hope that honesty might at last clear the poison. The next moment she fears that too much truth, too quickly, will shatter what little chance remains of Holden agreeing to help. So she hesitates even now, and that hesitation may be her most unforgivable flaw. Because when people have already been wounded by secrecy, even strategic silence begins to resemble a fresh betrayal. Stephanie wants redemption, but part of her still wants control over how that redemption unfolds. In a crisis this severe, that instinct may prove catastrophic. The emotional fault lines widen as everyone begins to choose sides, methods, and moral priorities. Tracy, though compassionate, may sense that Lily is no longer simply grieving. She is hardening into purpose. The daughter's pain is becoming a campaign, and while Tracy understands the impulse, she also sees its danger. A person desperate enough to save a loved one can begin believing that any pressure is justified if the cause is noble enough. Tracy may try to caution Lily against turning Holden into nothing more than a donor, against approaching him in a way that strips him of his humanity at the very moment he most needs to feel seen. But such wisdom becomes difficult to hear when time feels like an enemy. Lily might listen politely while inwardly rejecting the softness of that advice. From where she stands, philosophy is a luxury for people whose father is not dying. This is where her internal conflict becomes most painful. She knows Tracy is right, and yet she still feels unable to act according to that rightness. She is beginning to understand that grief does not always make people gentler. Sometimes it makes them efficient. Sometimes it makes them ruthless. Holden feels this shift even if no one openly names it. He can sense that the family's patience with his processing is already thinning. He can feel Lily's urgency tightening around him, can hear the unspoken accusation in every careful appeal to compassion. That pressure pushes him toward darker thoughts. If everyone already sees him as cruel for hesitating, then why not fully own the anger? Why not force them to confront the price of what was taken from him? Why not make them suffer uncertainty for once, the same way he is suffering it now? These are not thoughts he is proud of, but they rise inside him all the same, because wounded pride has its own appetite. Holden may begin to test the boundaries of his newfound power, not by making explicit demands, but by withholding reassurance. Let them wonder. Let them squirm. Let them finally feel the cost of a truth buried too long. Yet the deeper that impulse grows, the more it frightens him, because he recognizes in it the shape of the very manipulation he despises. If he lets bitterness guide him, then Stephanie's secrecy will not only have harmed his past, it will have colonized his character. Claire becomes the battleground where these impulses either soften or intensify. In her presence, Holden has a chance to remain human, not because she excuses his anger, but because she sees the pain beneath it without allowing him to romanticize it. She can understand why he is furious while still quietly refusing to let fury become identity. That balance is precisely why Holden keeps returning to her emotionally. She gives him room without giving him moral escape. Yet this closeness also risks creating its own tension. The more he relies on Claire's steadiness, the more vulnerable he becomes to feeling judged if her advice leans toward helping Malcolm. And the more Claire cares, the harder it becomes for her to remain detached from the practical stakes. She may tell herself she is only offering support, but in truth she is already invested in who Holden chooses to be. If he refuses, she will not be able to look at him in quite the same way. If he agrees, she may see a future in which this act of conscience becomes the foundation of something deeper between them. Holden may sense that too, and the awareness will complicate everything. He will not want to feel that Claire's esteem is something he must earn through obedience, yet he will also dread disappointing the one person who still believes the best of him might prevail. As Malcolm's condition continues to deteriorate, the family atmosphere becomes increasingly combustible. Rooms that should offer comfort begin to feel like courtrooms. Every glance seems to ask a question no one wants to say out loud. Every update from the hospital carries not just medical information, but moral weight. Stephanie's guilt hangs over everything like poison in the air. Lily's restraint grows thinner by the hour. Claire's compassion is tested by the fear that her sensitivity might be mistaken for weakness. Holden feels himself being watched from all sides, and the more watched he feels, the more his instinct is to retreat. Malcolm, meanwhile, is trapped in the worst position of all, too sick to force the issue, too ashamed to plead openly, too aware that his survival now depends on emotional terrain he does not know how to cross. He can only hope that something stronger than resentment still lives in the son he barely knows. This is where the darker edge of the story truly sharpens. It is not difficult to imagine others around them beginning to interfere in subtle ways, each convinced that their method is the necessary one. Someone may urge Lily to push harder, to stop treating Holden delicately when Malcolm's life is at stake. Someone may whisper to Holden that agreeing too quickly will erase his right to anger, that once he becomes the savior, everyone will expect instant forgiveness. Someone close to Stephanie may advise her to reveal less rather than more, afraid that a fuller confession will guarantee total rejection. These influences do not need to be openly malicious to be destructive. In families under pressure, half-truths and defensive instincts spread like fire. What begins as self-protection quickly becomes a new layer of manipulation. And because everyone can justify their choices through love, the damage becomes harder to confront honestly. The most haunting part of this crisis is that no one can emerge clean from it. If Holden refuses, Malcolm may decline further, and Lily may never forgive him. If Holden agrees, he may save Malcolm's life but still feel used, still feel that his choice was extracted from him through a web of guilt and expectation. If Lily pushes too hard and succeeds, she may preserve Malcolm's future only to damage her bond with Holden before it ever truly begins. If Claire remains too gentle, she may lose the trust of a family desperate for action. If she pushes too hard, she may lose Holden himself. If Stephanie confesses everything, she risks destroying what little credibility she has left. If she continues to paste the truth in fragments, she proves that fear still governs her. Every option is contaminated by the timing of the secret. Every path toward hope runs directly through the wreckage of betrayal. And yet, amid the fury, there remains one fragile possibility that makes the entire story so compelling. Holden may come to understand that agreeing to test is not surrendering to the people who failed him. It is refusing to let their failure define the limits of his own humanity. That distinction matters. It is the difference between being manipulated and making a choice no one can take from him. But for Holden to reach that point, he must first survive the rage. He must confront the temptation to weaponize Malcolm's illness as payback for years of silence. He must admit that part of him wants to punish, and that punishment would not heal him. Claire may help him see this. Lily may, in a harsher and less graceful way, force him to feel the consequences of delay. Malcolm's visible vulnerability may pierce the abstraction of the secret and make the stakes impossible to dismiss. Even Stephanie's remorse, however late, may serve as a warning of what life looks like when fear wins for too long. All of it may combine into the one realization Holden has been resisting, that saving Malcolm does not erase the betrayal, but refusing to help may chain him to it forever. If he moves toward testing, the atmosphere will shift instantly, but not into peace. Relief will come mixed with resentment, gratitude mixed with discomfort, hope mixed with the terrible awareness that one choice cannot undo years of damage. Lily may feel as if she can breathe again, only to discover that survival creates its own new questions. Can she trust herself after seeing how hard and manipulative she became under pressure? Can she build a real sibling relationship with Holden after spending days seeing him primarily as Malcolm's last chance? Claire may feel the bond with Holden deepen, but she will also have to navigate the fact that much of their closeness was born out of crisis and moral urgency rather than uncomplicated romance. Malcolm may gain a path toward life, yet still face the emotional burden of learning how to relate to a son whose first real act of connection was medical salvation rather than love freely grown over time. Stephanie may celebrate the possibility of redemption, but she will know that no successful outcome can erase the fact that she created the conditions for this agony in the first place. That is what gives the story its true emotional force. It is not about a donor search alone. It is about what happens when family becomes both refuge and weapon, when illness forces buried truths into the light, when love and resentment occupy the same room and refuse to separate. Lily is pushed into confronting the ugliest side of devotion, the way fear can make a loving daughter capable of turning grief into pressure. Holden is pushed into confronting the heaviest consequence of betrayal, the temptation to let pain become cruelty, because cruelty feels like control. Claire is pushed into discovering whether compassion can survive proximity to moral chaos without being swallowed by it. Malcolm is pushed into the humiliation of needing grace from the very life he was denied the chance to nurture. Stephanie is pushed into the final collapse of every excuse she once used to protect herself from the truth. In the end, the cruel beauty of this crisis lies in its uncertainty. Hope is alive, but it is not pure. Reconciliation is possible, but it will not arrive neatly. Even if Holden becomes the answer Malcolm needs, no one will simply move on. The family will carry the memory of this reckoning for years, the memory of a daughter who could not save her father with her own body, a son who discovered his bloodline only when death came calling, a woman whose secrecy turned love into damage, and another woman whose quiet support may have helped stop that damage from becoming fatal. The question is no longer whether the truth will change them. It already has. The real question is whether, after all this rage and shame and pressure, they can build anything honest out of what remains. Because sometimes the greatest battle is not saving a life. It is deciding what kind of family deserves to exist after the saving is done.